When I was 10 years old, they left me on a porch because they said I was a curse. 20 years later, they didn't show up with flowers or apologies. They sent a lawyer with a letter that rattled louder than any knock at the door. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, proof that betrayal can travel by certified mail. Heavy white embossed with a seal I knew too well, Klein and Morton attorneys at law. The kind of stationery that thinks it's important just because the paper is thicker than skin. I ran my fingers along the raised edges, the press of authority, the echo of a family crest I hadn't seen in decades. My name, Isabella Cruz, typed neatly across the front. No return address, though the silence screamed theirs. I slit the envelope with the same letter opener I use at Proofline, the organization I built so no one else would ever feel erased. At Proofline, evidence is sacred screenshots, receipts, medical records, adoption papers. Every fragment has weight. Every line of ink is a heartbeat rescued. But this was different. This was the past in black ink trying to rewrite itself. Inside a letter on thick cream stock, the font was deliberate serif conservative, the language calculated. And there, highlighted in neon yellow, 2 words leapt out at me: familial continuity. That was their justification. Not love, not reunion, not even the coward's word mistake. Just continuity. A sterile corporate way of saying bloodline as if DNA could be notarized. They weren't asking to see me. They weren't asking how I'd survived after they locked the door and labeled me a bad omen. They were demanding access to what I had built. Proofline. The databases, the tech, the name I'd carved out of all the absences they left me with. They didn't knock on my door. They knocked on my wallet. They didn't knock on my door. They knocked on my wallet. That sentence repeated in my head, sharp as glass. For years, my family had ignored birthdays, graduations, the first tiny apartment where I paid rent with 2 part-time jobs and a borrowed futon. They had skipped over the smell of antiseptic when I stitched my own wounds, the smell of burnt coffee during overnight coding sessions, the milestones no one else witnessed but me. And now they wanted to appear not in flesh and blood, but in legal jargon and billing hours. I stared at the letter until the words blurred. My pulse slowed, not sped. I'd trained myself for this: every record I had ever kept, every receipt, every note. At 10, I was a curse. At 30, I was a file system. If they wanted a case, they would get a case. But the case would be mine. Proofline was never meant for revenge. I built it to archive existence for kids like me, those who grew up hearing we never said that never happened. You're imagining things. I knew the cost of erased memories, and I knew the power of evidence when silence tried to bury truth. That envelope wasn't just an insult. It was Exhibit A. I slid the letter into a clear archival sleeve, the kind we use for fragile documents. I labeled it in black ink. Return to sender 20 years later. Artifact Darawanza 1 in the Cruz Klein archive. Because that's how I survive, by cataloging cruelty until it can no longer hide in shadows. My hands didn't shake. Not anymore. At 10, I had trembled. At 20, I had burned. At 30, I recorded. My weapon was the same one they had underestimated: paper. Paper that could outlast lies, seals that could be broken but not erased. The irony stung, though. The same family who had left me with nothing but a backpack now claimed rights to everything I had built. They dressed it up in legal language, in continuity, in lineage. But all I could hear was the echo of that night, the sound of a door closing, the scrape of shoes walking away, and the word curse trailing like smoke. I placed the sleeve in a binder marked Klein Archive Spine, labeled in white. Then I wrote the line that would guide me through the fight. They didn't knock on my door. They knocked on my wallet. And this time, I wasn't 10. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come. I was 30, with records sharp enough to cut through every lie they had mailed my way. The memory doesn't fade. It loops like old footage, grainy yet sharp where it hurts most. I was 10 years old, standing on the front porch of a house that would never be mine again. The engine idled in the driveway, a low growl in the twilight. The car door slammed metal on metal, echoing like a judge's gavel. That was the punctuation mark of my childhood. Not a period written in ink, but in sound. The sound of my family history was a car door slamming shut. I had a backpack slung across my shoulders, blue nylon scuffed at the corners, zipper teeth snagged from overuse. It held a sweater, 2 notebooks, and a toothbrush. No stuffed animals, no photos, nothing soft. Someone had decided even my comfort was expendable. On the porch beside me lay the artifacts that would later become my Exhibit B, a crumpled parking stub stamped with the time 6:42 p.m., and a Polaroid snapped by chance from across the street, a neighbor testing an old camera. In the frame, a little girl stands on cracked cement while the back of a station wagon disappears into blur. That Polaroid became proof. The stub, too. Because when you're told later it never happened, when you're told families don't abandon children, not really. Not in such cold daylight, you need something more than memory to argue back. You need paper. You need images. You need the world to see what your eyes saw, what your ears recorded. The house behind me was still humming with the aftertaste of dinner. I could smell the fried onions clinging to my sleeves. Inside chairs, scraped voices carried the rhythm of a family continuing without me. But on the porch, the silence was suffocating. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was vacancy. A vacancy carved with intention. I remember shifting my weight from one sneaker to the other as if movement could undo stillness, as if rocking could rewind time. It couldn't. I waited for someone to come back out. For my mother's perfume to drift through the doorway, for my father's shadow to fall across the steps. I waited for the sound of feet hurrying with regret. Instead, the only sound was the car pulling away tires grinding against gravel. They didn't look back. They didn't hesitate at the corner. The taillights blinked once right turn and then they were gone. I told myself maybe they were testing me. Maybe if I waited long enough, they'd circle back, apologize, scoop me into the car again. I counted minutes by tracing the ridges of the porch railing with my fingers. 1, 2, 10. By the time the streetlights flickered on, I knew the truth: no one was coming. The test wasn't mine. The test was theirs, and I had failed it simply by existing. Years later, when I replayed that night, I realized how final the choreography had been. The timing of the engine, the deliberate closing of the door, the way no words were exchanged. That wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. My family didn't leave in chaos. They left in order, as though abandonment had been scheduled into the calendar. That's why I keep the stub and the photo. Artifacts don't lie. Gasps fade. Promises warp memory blurs, but ink stamps and images, they outlast denial. Proofline was born from this night, though I didn't know it then. Proofline is my way of turning porches into archives, of making silence speak. I sometimes wonder what my face looked like to the stranger behind that Polaroid. Did I appear lost or simply suspended? Did they understand they were capturing not just a child, but a verdict? In the photo, my posture is too still for 10. My arms hang straight. Fingers curled like they'd already let go of childhood. The street lamp bends light across my hair, giving it a false halo. If you didn't know the context, you might mistake it for a portrait of patience. But I know better. That halo was just a streetlight, and patience was the name for abandonment. I placed that photo in a clear sleeve years later next to the stub. Together, they read like scripture, the book of erasure. Chapter 1. And every time my family tries to overwrite the past, I return to these pages. The sound of my family history was a car door slamming shut. That sentence is carved into me deeper than bloodlines. It reminds me that beginnings can be violent and endings can masquerade as ordinary sounds. A door, an engine, gravel under tires. My origin story isn't lullabies or blessings. It's the metallic slam of departure. And that's what I carry, proof sound and silence, into every room where they try to deny who I am. The first door closed on me. The second one opened. May Park lived 2 houses down in the brick duplex with ivy creeping up the side and a porch light that always burned a little too bright. She was the neighbor kids whispered about, quiet, widowed, always with her nose in a book. But that night she became something else, the first witness who didn't look away. I still remember the smell when she opened her door. Cinnamon and old pages. Quills of spice from tea she boiled at dusk, and the musk of books stacked in every corner like walls made of paper. The warmth of it hit me before her words did. My own house had reeked of fried onions and judgment. May's smelled like safety disguised as clutter. She didn't act surprised to see me standing there with a backpack and hollow eyes. She didn't gasp or fumble or look over my shoulder expecting someone taller, older, responsible to explain my presence. She simply stepped aside, and in that small gesture, she rewrote what family could mean. On her kitchen counter sat a rotary phone with a yellow Post-it stuck to the receiver. Scrawled in blocky handwriting, Child Protective Services appointment rescheduled tomorrow, 9 a.m. The official call had been made, but bureaucracy runs on calendars, not on crises. The state wouldn't come until morning. Until then, I was in limbo. Except May refused to leave me there. Next to the phone was another artifact I keep in my archive, a chipped mug half full of cocoa. A ring of milk curdled along the rim. That night, she pressed a fresh mug into my hands, steaming thick with sugar, the kind of sweetness that coats grief long enough for a child to swallow it. My palms wrapped around it like it was evidence of my own existence. Because it was. I sipped, and for the first time in hours, the shaking in my chest slowed. May didn't ask why my parents left. She didn't pry for details. Didn't feed her curiosity with my pain. She just said the words that split my world in two. May didn't ask me who I belonged to. She asked me what I needed right now. That question was so simple, yet no one in my family had ever asked it. Not once. At home, I was either a burden to be silenced or a curse to be carried. With May, I was a person in need of blankets, cocoa, and silence thick enough to breathe in. She gave me all three. The living room was crowded with towers of hardcovers, the kind that smelled of glue and time. She laid out a blanket on the sofa, its edges frayed from decades of use. I slid under it like a soldier into a trench braced for attack. But the only sound was the turning of her pages as she sat across from me reading quietly, keeping vigil without intruding. Every so often, she would rise, pad into the kitchen, and return with another sticky note to tack beside the phone lists of things to remember for me. Ask about school transfer, pack sweater, extra toothbrush. Those notes became part of my archive, two fragments of someone's thoughtfulness preserved in ink. Proof that a stranger had stepped into the void my family left behind. At one point, I caught her watching me not with pity, but with calculation. As if she were mentally adding me into her system, cataloging what needed to be done the way librarians catalog books, carefully, meticulously, so nothing is lost. That look steadied me. If May was making a record of me, then I hadn't been erased. The night stretched long. Shadows climbed the walls and the radiator hissed like a living thing. I clutched the cocoa until it cooled, then left the cup on the table. The white smear of milk sliding down the porcelain dried into a permanent crescent. Years later, when I boxed up my artifacts, I asked May if I could keep that cup. She laughed softly, handed it to me, and said, "Every case needs a first exhibit." She was right. That cup still sits in my Proofline office behind glass-tagged Artifact 002. A reminder that history isn't just what wounds you. It's also who hands you cocoa when you can't stop shaking. May Park wasn't my savior. She didn't pretend to fix what had been broken beyond repair. But she did something more radical. She bore witness. She didn't ask me to explain myself. Didn't reduce me to bloodlines or curses. She asked the only question that mattered. What do you need right now? And that question was the thread I would later use to stitch my life together. When people romanticize rescue, they picture fireworks, sirens, declarations. Mine was quieter. It was the sound of a mug being set gently on a table, the scratch of pen against a sticky note, the rustle of a blanket unfolded for someone who wasn't expected. That's how my second door opened. Not with spectacle, but with cocoa and paper cinnamon and silence. And it was enough. Mail has a way of telling the truth people refuse to speak. When I was a kid, after the night of the car door, I still wrote letters to my parents. Foolish maybe, but necessary. Pages torn from school notebooks, scrawled with pencil lines that pressed too hard my 10-year-old handwriting, leaning like it wanted to run away from itself. I signed each one Isabella, hoping the name alone might be enough to remind them I existed. I mailed them faithfully birthdays, Christmas, even Tuesdays when loneliness pressed against my ribs. Sometimes I slipped in drawings, crooked houses, stick figures holding hands. Sometimes I folded report cards into the envelopes, proof I was trying. Always I wrote the same closing, "Please write back." They never did. Instead, the envelopes started coming back. Weeks later, sliding through May Park's mail slot, rubber stamped in red, "Return to sender." The words shouted louder than silence. They were official rejection bureaucracy's way of saying, "You don't live here anymore." I stacked them at first in a shoebox, each envelope a soldier in a losing war. One by one, they returned to me like deserters weary from the journey. Creased, scuffed their corners, bent from sorting machines that didn't care. The ink of my handwriting smeared where the rain had kissed it. I lined them up on the floor like tired infantry facing forward, silent, loyal only to me. May would find me crouched over them some nights, arranging and rearranging like a general trying to make sense of a broken front line. She'd shake her head gently, set down a mug of cocoa beside me, and let me keep building my paper army. She didn't stop me. She understood when you've been erased, even rejection feels like evidence. Because that's what those letters were, not just failures of delivery, but proof. Proof that I had reached out. Proof that they had not reached back. Proof that a child had tried to stitch herself back into a fabric her parents had already cut. I kept them. All of them. Today they live in Archive Box 1 at Proofline, carefully sleeved in plastic, numbered and cataloged. When new clients walk into my office and tell me no one believes what happened, I show them my soldiers. I show them the envelopes that carried my small voice into the void and came back stamped with rejection. And I tell them, when an address no longer belongs to you, a letter becomes evidence. That line has carried me through more hearings and mediations than I can count. Judges understand evidence. They don't always understand abandonment, but they understand postmarks. There's one envelope I hold closest. March 14, 2006. I was 11. I had written about my spelling bee, how I'd spelled resilience correctly in the final round. I thought the irony would impress them, even if they didn't know the word. The letter came back 3 weeks later, the red stamp overlapping the name Klein like blood across a family crest. That envelope is the centerpiece of my archive. Sometimes at night, I imagine all the letters I never sent. The ones I wrote but tore up before mailing the drafts that littered the wastebasket. If the sent letters are my soldiers, then the unsent ones are ghosts, silent ranks still haunting me. But the returned envelopes, they breathe. They testify. They are my chorus of no's delivered in triplicate, notarized by indifference. When the lawyer's letter arrived 20 years later, claiming familial continuity, I placed it side by side with the shoebox full of returns. Continuity. The evidence said otherwise. Continuity had been severed in rubber ink. Continuity had been shredded by post office machines and sealed by stamps that declared me a stranger to my own blood. The irony is sharp. The family that refused to accept my letters now demands access to my life's work. They wouldn't open a 10-year-old's plea for recognition, but they'll happily open a 30-year-old's bank account. I think about that sometimes, the cruelty of mail. Envelopes are blunt instruments. They carry joy or devastation with the same neutral face. But when you've been left behind, every envelope becomes a mirror. Mine reflected a truth my family never said out loud. You are not welcome here. So I keep them row upon row, sleeved and tagged. Not because I want to remember the sting, but because I want the record to outlast me. Paper doesn't heal, but it holds. And in holding it proves. When an address no longer belongs to you, a letter becomes evidence. That's why Proofline exists. To keep the evidence breathing even when the voices go quiet. Money has a way of telling a story even colder than words. I didn't learn about the account until years later when May Park helped me file for student aid. We were sifting through old documents, birth certificate, immunization card, the fragile trail of papers that proved I existed. That's when we founded a bank account opened the day I was born. My grandmother's idea, a seed fund meant to carry me into adulthood. Small deposits over the years, each one marked with my initials. I used to imagine what it might feel like to turn 18 and see a balance waiting for me. Proof that someone somewhere had believed in my future. But when I finally asked about it at the bank, the teller frowned, tapped the keyboard, and shook her head. The balance was zero. Not just zero, it had been emptied 2 weeks after the night I was left on the porch. The record was clean, too clean. Withdrawal slips signed in the careful cursive of Ruth and Gideon Klein. My parents. My signature wasn't needed. The law didn't care what a 10-year-old thought about her own savings. They were the guardians. The money was theirs to take. I held that slip in my hands like a death certificate. The ink was dark, the lines sharp. The bank clerk had stamped the date crisp as judgment June 17th, 2004. That stamp became another artifact in my archive sleeved in plastic-tagged Exhibit Naro 5. I stared at it for a long time, whispering the line that etched itself into my bones. One signature can evaporate a childhood. That's what it felt like. Years of my grandmother's careful planning gone with the arc of 2 pens. Childhood savings siphoned into silence. I wasn't just abandoned. I was liquidated. When I built Proofline, I thought about that slip often. About how signatures are worshipped in courts, contracts, ledgers, as if a flourish of ink carries divine authority. But I knew better. I knew signatures could also be weapons' thin blades that cut decades of love in an instant. Sometimes I picture my grandmother writing checks into that account, maybe humming as she folded the stubs into her drawer. Maybe she imagined me buying books for college or furniture for my first apartment. She never imagined her son and daughter-in-law walking into a bank and signing her love into nothingness. But they did. I keep a copy of that slip pinned above my desk at Proofline. Not to remind myself of loss, I don't need reminders, but to remind myself of what erasure looks like on paper. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just signs its name and walks away. When the lawyer's letter arrived 20 years later, quoting familial continuity, I thought of that slip. Continuity. There was no continuity. They had severed the line the moment they drained that account. They had chosen erasure, and I had the paper to prove it. Have you ever discovered a signature used against you instead of for you? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if no. People ask why I cling to artifacts. Why I keep slips of paper that most would shred. I tell them it's because artifacts outlive denial. My parents can stand in court and say they never abandoned me. They can say it was complicated, necessary, misunderstood. But the slip tells a cleaner story: 2 signatures. A balance emptied a date, stamped forever. Evidence has no shame. It doesn't blush. It doesn't rewrite itself. It sits in its sleeve, quiet and patient, waiting for the day it's called to testify. One signature can evaporate a childhood. That's the truth I built Proofline on. Not revenge, not rage, just record. Every artifact is a lifeline for the kids who come after me, the ones who will sit across my desk and whisper, "They said it never happened." I'll hand them a sleeve and say, "Show me the paper. Let's keep it breathing." Because signatures can take away, but they can also give power back when you refuse to let them disappear. Graduation is supposed to be a beginning, but mine felt like an erasure in real time. The gymnasium smelled of varnished floors and polyester gowns, the kind of cheap triumph that clings to every public school ceremony. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the court, neat grids of expectation. Parents clustered in the bleachers' cameras, ready applause rehearsed. My classmates shifted nervously in their seats, adjusting tassels, whispering about scholarships and road trips. I sat in the far corner next to the exit sign that glowed red like a warning. My chair scraped against the emergency door, cold metal pressing into my shoulder each time I shifted. It wasn't an accident. It was placement, deliberate, quiet, humiliating. When they passed out the printed programs, I flipped through eagerly, searching for my name. Page after page, alphabet marching like soldiers, but the line that should have held Cruz Isabella wasn't there. My eyes scanned twice, then 3 times, then once more in disbelief. The space wasn't blank. They hadn't forgotten to print a row. My name had been removed as clean as a scalpel cut. The artifact still lives in my archive, that flimsy program creased from my grip corners, bent ink smudged where my fingers had pressed too hard. Next to it, the seating chart, hand-drawn in pencil by a teacher's assistant, showing a neat arrangement of names and rows. In the bottom corner, an unlabeled square by the exit my chair. Evidence of how erasure doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. When the principal took the stage reading names into the microphone, each syllable hung heavy in the air. Applause rose and fell like a tide. I clutched the program in my lap, a prop that denied my existence even as my body sat in the room. The irony burned. My family had abandoned me at 10, and now my school, the place meant to catalog growth, was erasing me at 17. I kept waiting for a correction, for someone to notice the mistake, to call my name anyway. But mistakes don't sit this clean. This was no clerical error. This was choreography. Someone had chosen not to type the letters of my name, not to arrange the ink, not to mark me as present. They called it arrangement. I called it erasure. That sentence has followed me for years. Administrators call it logistics. Families call it tradition. But for those of us who live on the margins of someone else's neat diagram, we know what it is: deletion disguised as order. When my classmates tossed their caps in the air, I didn't. My hand stayed in my lap, still gripping that program. Because what was I celebrating? A ceremony that drew a line through me. A system that pretended I hadn't made it to the finish line. I walked out with the others, but not in triumph. I walked out carrying Exhibit 06 in my invisible case file. Years later, when I founded Proofline, I showed that program to a client who had been erased from her family's will. She nodded slowly and said, "It feels the same, doesn't it?" And I told her yes. Whether it's a missing name on a page or a missing seat at the table, the wound is identical. Sometimes when I look at the program now, I imagine the printer spitting it out one page at a time. Hundreds of names cascading into permanence except mine. I imagine the cursor hovering over my name on the draft file, then the deliberate keystrokes deleting it. Backspace, backspace, gone. People think erasure is loud, but it isn't. It's quiet. It's polite. It's someone sliding you to the edge of the seating chart, pressing you against the exit so your absence blends with architecture. It's someone nodding at the program and saying, "That's just the arrangement." But I know better. Arrangement is when you shuffle cards. This was erasure. And I've kept the paper to prove it. Every archive begins somewhere. Mine began on the back of a receipt. I was 19, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a one-bedroom apartment that smelled of ramen and damp plaster. May had driven me there with boxes of donated cookware and the kind of practical advice that fits in sticky notes. Pay rent on time. Save every receipt. Don't trust handshakes. I was supposed to feel triumphant. First lease in my name. First door key that didn't belong to anyone else. But instead, I felt the familiar emptiness of not seeing my name in the right places. No family photos on the fridge. No emergency contact listed at the clinic. No one clapping when my FAFSA came through. So I did what I had always done. I documented. On the back of that grocery receipt, I sketched a square box and wrote 2 words in thick ink. Start here. Then I drew myself and May just 2 stick figures. Because that was the true census of my life. No Ruth, no Gideon, no Elliot, no invented lineage, just us. That scrap became the first draft of Proofline. The artifact still exists, sealed in plastic brittle around the edges. Next to it is the notebook I filled that summer, to-do lists scrawled with panic and determination. Find scholarship, file taxes, pay utilities. The pages are streaked with coffee stains and pen grooves so deep they almost tear through. Every list was survival disguised as paperwork. I didn't know it then, but I was building an institution. Not out of ambition, but out of necessity. I needed a place where names couldn't be erased, where programs couldn't skip you, where signatures couldn't steal what was yours. When no one writes your name, you invent your own ledger. That became my creed. The first time I tried to design a logo, it was laughable: 2 uneven rectangles stacked like filing cabinets, drawn with a cheap ballpoint pen. I wrote the word Proofline above it, slanted shaky. The letters looked like they might topple. But it was enough. Enough to remind me that permanence had to start somewhere, even if it was crooked. Every night I added to the lists: rent, scholarship deadlines, food stamps, paperwork, job applications. My peers were doodling dreams of careers and weddings. I was doodling ledgers. But each line hardened me, trained me to see life as evidence. And evidence, unlike memory, doesn't bend. May would sit at my tiny table, sipping tea, watching me build lists with the patience of an accountant. Sometimes she'd slip in her own notes: buy winter boots, keep copies. She never said I was alone. She just showed me how to turn alone into organized. Looking back, I realized those lists weren't about tasks, they were about survival math. I didn't have parents to vouch for me. I didn't have a safety net. What I had were artifacts: receipts, stubs, signatures, photocopies. They were flimsy shields, but shields nonetheless. When Proofline became real, when the logo was refined by a designer and the database went live, I framed that original doodle. It hangs in my office, crooked lines and all right above the intake desk. Clients glance at it, laugh, and ask if it's a child's drawing. I tell them yes because I was still a child when I drew it, even if the world had decided otherwise. When no one writes your name, you invent your own ledger. That's why Proofline doesn't just collect evidence, it consecrates it. Every receipt, every letter, every program with a missing name becomes holy in its preservation. Proofline is a cathedral of paper born out of one girl's refusal to disappear. And it started with a scrap receipt, 2 stick figures, and the command, "Start here." The word duty has always made my skin crawl. It's the kind of word people use when they want to cage you in obligation without offering a shred of care in return. But I didn't expect it to arrive in the form of a letter official, embossed, stamped with the seal of a state that once ignored the fact I had been left on a porch. The envelope came from the law firm again, heavy with entitlement. I recognized the embossed crest, the same one from the first letter demanding continuity. I slid it open carefully like a surgeon making an incision. Inside 3 pages, typed in a stiff legal font, every paragraph bristling with precision designed to sound like inevitability. The demand was simple. I was expected to fund Elliot's college tuition. My younger brother. The boy who had never once reached out, never written, never asked if I had survived. The justification that the family had once supported me for 10 years. 1 decade of food and roof before the night of the porch was now being repackaged as a bill. The phrase that turned my stomach was underlined in red pen. Someone in their office had circled it as though to highlight the punchline family duty. That artifact sits in Proofline now in a sleeve labeled Exhibit 008, the letterhead from Klein and Morton. The official state stamp in the corner notarized like a brand, and the phrase family duty circled so aggressively the paper is nearly pierced. They turned duty into an invoice. That line repeated in my head until it became scripture. Because that's what the letter was, not a request. Not even a negotiation, but an itemized claim. According to them, my childhood was a debt. My survival had been an advance accruing interest, and the bill had finally come due. I read it again and again, each paragraph colder than the last. They listed Elliot's tuition, projected expenses, living costs. They cited precedent from cases where adult children had been ordered to support siblings. But nowhere in those pages was there mention of abandonment. Nowhere did it say these parents left a 10-year-old at a stranger's door. No mention of signatures siphoning my grandmother's savings. No mention of the returned letters. Their record was edited, cropped, curated to frame me not as a survivor, but as an ungrateful debtor. I sat at my desk with the letter spread in front of me, the seal of the state glaring in the corner. The seal looked official, but to me it looked like theater. Government ink stamping over a lie, trying to give it weight. My fingers traced the circled words, the indentation left by someone's pen. I imagined the lawyer pressing down hard, enjoying the permanence of the mark. They wanted me to feel it. May found me that evening, the letter still on the table, my hands pressed flat on either side. She read it silently, her jaw tightening. Then she poured tea and said, "Isabella, paper cuts both ways. They sent this as a weapon. You'll keep it as evidence." And she was right. Into the archive, it went, one more artifact in the growing case file of my life. What they didn't understand was that I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. When people erase you, you learn to keep receipts. When people call you a curse, you learn to document survival. Proofline wasn't built for them, but it was built to withstand them. Still, the cruelty of it lingered. They had recast abandonment as generosity and betrayal as credit. My childhood 10 years of being tolerated had become their justification to demand repayment. And Elliot, silent all these years, had been turned into a collection notice wearing a cap and gown. I wondered what Elliot knew. Did he understand what the letter claimed? Did he believe I owed him? Or was he just letting them use his name, another pawn in their endless game of appearances I couldn't know? But I knew this, he had never once called me sister. So I drafted my own record. I took the letter, slipped it into plastic, labeled it Exhibit 008, and wrote the summary line in black ink across the tag. They turned duty into an invoice. And when my clients ask me why Proofline matters, why archives matter, I show them that letter. I tell them, look, they will rewrite the past. They will twist care into credit and duty into debt. But paper has a memory of its own. Don't throw it away. Keep it breathing, because one day it will be your witness. That's why Proofline exists, not to fight in anger, but to preserve in clarity. Because when someone tries to drag you back into obligation, the cleanest defense is evidence. They turn duty into an invoice. And I refused to pay. The first thing I noticed was the subject line family. Just that. One word heavy as stone sent from an email address I barely recognized. When I clicked it open, there was no greeting. No Dear Isabella. No acknowledgement of years lost. Only the sentence typed without flourish, without punctuation, blood comes first. The sender, Travis Morton, my cousin. A man who had watched from the periphery as Ruth and Gideon erased me, then found his voice only when there was money at stake. I stared at the line bare and sanctimonious like scripture scribbled without context. Blood comes first. That was it. No memory, no apology, no inquiry about how I had survived. Just a sermon dropped into my inbox, a command dressed up as morality. I printed the email immediately. At Proofline, screens are too slippery. Paper has more gravity. I stuck it to the wall with a yellow sticky note above it, written in my hand. Silence consent. Because Travis's words assumed that because I hadn't answered their lawyer's letters, I had agreed. That my silence was permission. But I knew better. Silence had once been my survival. Silence had once wrapped me like a blanket. Now it was nothing but a lock. Silence used to be a warm blanket. Now it's a locked door. That line hummed in my chest as I read his email again. Travis tried to wrap himself in family righteousness as if bloodlines excused everything. He wrote about tradition, about continuity, echoing the lawyer's language like a parrot. He claimed I owed Elliot because we shared a name, because Ruth and Gideon had sacrificed for me once. Sacrifice. They had left me on a porch. They had siphoned my grandmother's savings. They had signed away my future with the stroke of a pen. But Travis called it sacrifice. The irony stung the family who had once declared me a curse, now insisted that curse had obligations. That I must step back into the circle because DNA demanded it. I pinned the email to my board beside the returned letters and the withdrawal slip. One more artifact. Exhibit Narezo 9. Proof that even absence produces paperwork. It wasn't the words that hurt most, it was the tone. Detached, sterile, the way people write memos to colleagues they've never met. My name wasn't even in it. Just blood comes first, like he was writing to the air. I remembered him as a boy older than me by a few years who once threw pebbles into the lake with me at a family picnic. We had shared watermelon on the dock, our hands sticky, our laughter loud. But when Ruth and Gideon left me behind, Travis didn't lift a finger. Didn't send a postcard. Didn't ask May if I was alive. He stayed silent, and that silence became complicity. So when his email arrived preaching about blood, I saw it for what it was, a hollow invocation, a weaponized cliché. I wrote no reply. Instead, I documented. The sticky note above it is still there in my office. Silence consent. It reminds me daily that the absence of response is not agreement. It is refusal. It is survival sharpened into clarity. That's the lesson I carry into Proofline. Our clients come with gaps in their stories, with years missing, with silences forced upon them. They whisper, but I never said no, as if silence convicts them. I show them Travis's email and my note above it. I tell them silence is not consent. It's the lock you place on a door to keep intruders out. Silence used to be a warm blanket. Now it's a locked door. For years, silence was the only thing I had. It covered me when I had no allies, no one to vouch for me. But silence doesn't last. Eventually, it becomes a cage. Proofline is my way of breaking that cage by speaking through paper, through evidence, through artifacts that cannot be denied. Travis never wrote again. Maybe he realized I wasn't answering. Maybe Ruth and Gideon told him to stop. But I didn't need another email. One was enough. One was enough to prove the hollowness of their bloodline argument to show that family duty was nothing more than invoices wrapped in sermons. So I keep it sleeved and cataloged not because his words matter, but because they don't. And sometimes the most damning evidence is emptiness dressed up as authority. That's the paradox of silence. It can protect you, but it can also erase you. And I refuse to be erased again. Every archive has a ghost, and mine lived in a shoebox. May handed it to me one spring evening years after the porch. A plain cardboard shoebox, the kind you almost throw away without looking. Inside, nestled between tissue paper and old receipts, was a stack of Hi-8 tapes camcorder relics from a neighbor across the street. He had been testing his new camera back in 2005, recording random footage of the block. Unwittingly, he had captured Exhibit 010 the night my life split open. I didn't watch the tape for weeks. I was afraid of seeing myself at 10 small and alone, preserved on shaky plastic. But eventually, I borrowed a digitizer, threaded the tape through, and pressed play. The screen flickered lines of static, giving way to a jittery picture. The camera wobbled, tilting up to the streetlight, then down again, focusing clumsily on my family's station wagon. The headlights flared too bright, then dimmed. You could hear my father's voice muffled, but clear enough, a sharp command, a clipped word I had spent years trying to forget. Then came the sound that still crawls under my skin, the tires grinding against gravel, chewing the earth as the car pulled away. The frame shook, zooming in and out the way amateurs film. But what mattered wasn't the blur. It was the stillness at the center, a 10-year-old girl on a porch backpack slumped frozen in disbelief. Me. In the corner of the footage, a digital timestamp blinked April 3rd, 2005. That date has become one of the pillars of my archive proof, etched not in memory but in pixels. The shoebox tape has been digitized, sealed, and labeled Exhibit 010. The file lives in multiple encrypted drives at Proofline, backed up redundantly because some truths deserve immortality. The frame shakes, but the truth stands still. That's what I whisper whenever I watch it. The image trembles, the camera operator unsteady, but the evidence does not waver. You can see the door close. You can hear the car. You can watch a child not follow. That's truth unvarnished. When I show clients the footage, they gasp. Some cry. Not for me, but for themselves, because they see in the flicker of that grainy image their own erased moments. The birthday unacknowledged. The slammed door. The missing chair. Proofline isn't just my archive. It's a mirror. I remember the first time I showed the clip in court, projected onto a wall larger than life. My parents' attorney objected, called it irrelevant, said it didn't prove intent. But the room was already silent, because while lawyers debate images testify, no one could look away from that timestamp, April 3rd, 2005. The day abandonment stopped being a rumor and became a record. People underestimate artifacts like this. They think technology from decades ago is too fragile, too glitchy to hold weight. But glitches are human too. The shaky zoom, the off-kilter focus, they make it real. They make it undeniable. I've watched the clip dozens of times, always searching for something new. A flicker of hesitation in my father's voice, a shadow in the window, anything to suggest it wasn't deliberate. But there's nothing. The footage is blunt. They left, I stayed, the camera caught it. No excuses. Sometimes I imagine the neighbor who filmed it. Did he realize as he replayed his test footage that night what he had captured? Or did he toss the tape into a drawer, never giving it a second thought? Artifacts don't care about intent. They wait. And when the time comes, they reveal. That shoebox changed everything for me. Until then, I had paper return letters, withdrawal slips, seating charts. But paper can be doubted. Paper can be forged. Video, though it breathes. It has sound, light, motion. It gives a ghost a body. The frame shakes, but the truth stands still. That's why Proofline isn't just about saving receipts. It's about saving the tremor in a voice, the scrape of gravel under tires, the timestamp that blinks quietly in the corner of a frame. Because truth doesn't always arrive polished. Sometimes it arrives grainy, rundown, nearly lost in a shoebox. But once found, it doesn't let go. And I won't let it. Every family has its whispered stories. Mine had evidence. When Nadia Quinn came into the picture, she didn't arrive as a savior or a friend. She came as a journalist with a camera that never blinked. One take, she said, setting up the tripod in the small conference room at Proofline. No edits. No retakes. This is record keeping. Her voice was sharp, steady, like she was calling the room itself to attention. The kind of tone that makes even the air obey. She wasn't after drama. She was after accuracy. And that mattered because my story had been staged too many times by other people, cropped, denied, rewritten. Nadia wanted it plain. The artifact from that day is a single file, a video stamped with the metadata of the camera. Date, time, location, a digital signature embedded in code immune to denial. Exhibit Namamer 0011. My voice. My face, my words captured in their unpolished state. I remember the weight of the microphone clipped to my collar. I remember my palms pressing against the table to steady myself. For a moment, I thought of every graduation I had been erased from, every name tag that had gone missing, every program without me. And then I spoke. I didn't say, "You hurt me." I didn't say, "I'll make you pay." Revenge had no place in my ledger. What I said was simple. This is the record. Nadia didn't interrupt. She didn't nod. She just let the silence hold my words in place like pins on a map. I don't burn bridges, I mark harbors. That line has been quoted back to me more times than I can count. People think it sounds poetic, but for me it was literal. I wasn't erasing the past. I wasn't trying to torch what had been. I was marking it location date evidence so no one could ever claim it hadn't existed. That's the difference between vengeance and record keeping. Vengeance wants to destroy. Records want to endure. And I had endured enough silence to know which one mattered. Nadia uploaded the clip that night. No music. No title cards. Just me speaking into the lens, saying the words my family had refused to hear. Within days, the views climbed. Not viral, nothing flashy. Just steady, consistent, like people who had been waiting their whole lives to hear someone say it out loud that documentation is dignity. The comments flooded in. This happened to me too. Thank you for saying it plain. My family said it never happened, but I still have the receipts. It wasn't catharsis. It was solidarity. Proof that record keeping wasn't just mine, it was ours. My family tried to dismiss it, of course. They called it a stunt, a smear. But the video wasn't framed as attack. It was framed as archive. Nadia had been careful. Every word was backed by paper, by timestamp, by artifact. This wasn't defamation. It was preservation. That's why it cut so deep. Because you can argue with feelings. You can argue with motives. But you can't argue with evidence staring into a lens naming itself without apology. Afterward, Nadia handed me the drive. "You'll want to keep this," she said. "One day they'll say you never said it. This proves you did. Exhibit number 0111, stored in multiple backups, cataloged like all the rest. Sometimes I watch it back not out of pride, but out of discipline, to remind myself what it feels like to say the truth without shaking. To remind myself that the work isn't about punishing the past, but about ensuring it doesn't vanish. I don't burn bridges, I mark harbors. That's what Proofline is. Not flames, not ruins. Harbors. Places where stories dock and stay no matter how rough the seas get. Have you ever spoken your truth not to attack, but simply to record it? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if not yet. Some meetings are staged like theater. Others unfold like traps. The private reconciliation was both. The letter had come first, polite on the surface venom underneath an invitation to sit down with Ruth and Gideon to resolve matters within the family. My attorney, Mira Chen, raised one eyebrow when she read it. Then she slid a small recorder across the table toward me. "Wear it," she said. "You can't edit tape the way you edit memory." So when I walked into that dim hotel conference room, I wasn't just a daughter estranged. I was an archivist with a wire. The air was thick with false civility. A carafe of water in the center of the table glasses already sweating. My parents dressed in coordinated neutrals faces, painted in the expressions of peacemakers. Gideon gestured toward the chair across from him like we were strangers negotiating a contract. Ruth pressed her palms together as if in prayer. The recorder in my jacket pocket hummed silently. A red light blinked once, then held steady. Artifact in progress. We began with pleasantries shallow as puddles, but soon enough the script revealed itself. Gideon leaned forward, voice low, practiced. You have to understand, Isabella. The foundation you stand on, your education, your opportunities, those came from us. Ruth chimed in a note higher, echoing his words. Yes, the platform we gave you. That's what allowed you to build this proofline thing. I felt the words hit like stones. The platform they gave me. A porch in the dark. Returned letters stamped in red. A drained account. My name missing from a graduation program. That was the foundation. That was the platform. Yet here they were narrating a version where abandonment had been generosity. The recorder caught it all. Time code stamped each second. 1402 Gideon claims foundation we gave. 1405 Ruth echoes platform. Clean, undeniable, preserved. You can't edit tape the way you edit memory. That sentence pulsed in my mind as I nodded along, face neutral, letting them speak. Because this wasn't debate, it was documentation. Mira sat beside me, legal pad, open, her pen barely moving. Every so often she glanced at me, subtle as a signal. Stay steady. Stay present. Let the record speak. And so I did. I asked questions, calm, almost casual. So you're saying leaving me with May was part of the plan, that draining the account was strategy? Their answers tangled, tripping over contradictions. Gideon said it was temporary. Ruth said it was for the greater good. Both insisted it was family duty. The same phrase I had seen circled in red on the lawyer's letter. Every word sank into the recorder, time-stamped. 14, 17, Gideon, temporary. 1418, Ruth, greater good. The contradictions stacking like cards, fragile, ready to topple. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply let them keep talking, filling the air with their justifications. Because one day, when they claimed in court they had never said these things, I would press play. And the tape would speak louder than any memory. The artifact lives now in Proofline, a transcript bound in black cover, every key phrase highlighted, time codes running down the margins. Exhibit number 012. When I read it, I still hear the hum of the air conditioner in that room, the clink of glass when Ruth adjusted her water, the low vibration of my own pulse in my ears. They thought a private meeting meant secrecy. But secrecy only lasts if no one records. And I record everything. When we finally stood to leave, Gideon offered a handshake. His palm was warm, rehearsed. Mine was steady, cool. Ruth gave me a look she must have practiced in the mirror, half sorrow, half superiority. I returned nothing. Because nothing needed to be returned. The evidence was already mine. Mira walked me out to the hallway, her expression unreadable. Then she said, almost as an afterthought, You did well. That tape will matter. She was right. Paper speaks, images testify. But audio breathes. It captures hesitation tone, the slippage between what people mean and what they say. And no amount of polished denial can scrub it clean. You can't edit tape the way you edit memory. That line became the summary tag on the transcript. My reminder that memory is fragile, malleable, easily dismissed. But tape is merciless. Courtrooms don't echo the way movies promise. They don't roar with outrage or thunder with gavel strikes. They hum with paper shuffling heels, clicking on linoleum, the low buzz of fluorescent lights. Its bureaucracy set to a steady metronome. And sometimes, in that quiet truth finally arrives. The hearing that day wasn't dramatic. There were no surprise witnesses, no shouting lawyers. Just me seated beside Mira Chen, stacks of exhibits arranged like fortifications, the withdrawal slip, the returned letters, the graduation program, with my name missing the tape transcript. Each artifact sleeved, labeled, cataloged. My life translated into evidence. Across the aisle sat Ruth and Gideon, back straight, clothes pressed. Their lawyer tried to soften their narrative, painting them as misunderstood parents simply asking for help with Elliot's tuition. Words like continuity and duty floated through the air, the same tired refrains. But when Mira rose, her voice was quiet steel. Your Honor, she said, continuity requires consistency. What we have here is documented abandonment. And then she laid the artifacts down one by one as if setting stones on a path. The red stamps of return to sender, the withdrawal slip signed in their hands, the graduation program my chair shoved against the exit, the audio transcript where they admitted calling it a platform. Each piece undeniable, each time code merciless. The judge flipped through the document's expression, unreadable. The silence stretched. My pulse ticked against my ribs like a second clock. Finally, the words came plain and unadorned. Ms. Cruz does not owe her parents or her brother anything, financially or otherwise. It wasn't a dramatic declaration, but it landed like an earthquake. Years of gaslighting unraveled in a single sentence. A verdict stamped into permanence. I exhaled. Not joy, not triumph, just release, like setting down a weight I had carried since the porch. My hands trembled slightly as Mira slid the final document toward me, the order stamped with the court seal ink still damp. The artifact now lives in proofline under the folder family, spine labeled in black court seal and boundary. When I cataloged it, I wrote the line that has since become my mantra: a seal doesn't heal, but it ends. That's the truth of verdicts. They don't stitch childhoods back together. They don't return savings or erase lonely nights. They don't put your name back in the program or call your seat into the spotlight. What they do is draw a line. Before and after. Boundaries notarized by law. When I placed that stamped order into the archive, I didn't feel vindication. I felt clarity. For once, the erasure wasn't mine to carry. The record spoke louder than the myth. Ruth avoided my eyes as we left the courtroom. Gideon's jaw tightened, lips pressed thin. They would no doubt invent another story, another narrative to soften their image. But the seal had already fallen. Paper beats rumor. And the archive doesn't bend to revision. Sometimes late at night I look at that stamped order and think about all the children who never get one, who carry debts that aren't theirs. Obligations disguised as love chains, disguised as duty. That's why Proofline exists, to show them they can put their own evidence in sleeves, build their own archive, claim their own endings. Because that's what the order was. For me, not healing, not absolution, but an ending. An official line in the ledger: you owe them nothing. A seal doesn't heal, but it ends. And sometimes that's enough. The invitation arrived on thick cardstock embossed in gold as if shine could disguise the weight of history. A family gathering formal dinner, the kind of event where appearances mattered more than air. My name was printed neatly on the envelope, spelled correctly this time, as though that could undo decades of erasure. I told myself I didn't need to go. The court had already drawn its line. I owed them nothing. And yet some part of me knew I had to attend, not to belong, but to close. The ballroom smelled of polished silverware and overwatered flowers. Chandeliers cast light too bright, bouncing off crystal flutes like applause that never reached me. A hostess guided me through the maze of tables, each adorned with centerpieces taller than sightlines designed to make people feel important. She stopped at a table near the kitchen doors. My place card sat there, propped up, the same word stamped across it in sharp black ink: overflow. It wasn't even my name, just a category, a label for extras, a polite way of saying, we don't know where you fit, so we'll put you where you won't be seen. I slid the chair back, felt the hum of the kitchen staff rushing behind me, the clang of pans underscoring the message. This wasn't a seat of welcome. It was a reminder, even when they included me, it was only as excess. For a long moment, I stared at the card. Its edges were sharp, unbent, unmarked. Too clean. It waited for my compliance, for me to sit quietly in the corner while the center tables glowed under chandeliers. But compliance had always been their script, not mine. So I pulled a pen from my bag and with steady hand wrote across the card. This table was never mine. The ink bled slightly into the cardstock, dark veins spreading like roots. A message not for them, but for me. A reminder that I wasn't rejecting family. I was rejecting the role they kept assigning me: overflow, excess, ghost. I stood, straightened my coat, and walked out. No announcement. No scene. Just my heels striking the floor in time with my breath. Past the waiters balancing trays, past the gilded doors, past the echo of laughter staged for photographs. Outside, the air was sharp cool. Honest. I inhaled deeply the scent of asphalt and night breeze, cutting cleaner than perfume. I didn't feel hunger. I didn't feel regret. Because I hadn't left a meal behind, I had left a script. I didn't skip dinner. I quit the role of extra. That line carried me down the steps into the street, into the life I had built without them. Because family tables aren't just about food. They're stages. And for years, I had been cast as background, the reminder of what they didn't want to acknowledge. Tonight, I returned the role, refused the costume, handed back the lines. When I filed the place card into Proofline later that night, I labeled it Exhibit 0014. Not for its insult, but for its clarity. The archive isn't about pain alone, it's about the turning points when you stop asking to belong. The card sits now between the graduation program and the duty letter. Each artifact a script written for me. Each one an assignment I declined. Together they form a chorus, no more overflow. No more erasure. No more secondhand space. As I slid the binder shut, I thought of May, of the cocoa mug with the dried milk ring, of her question. What do you need right now? The answer then had been warmth, safety. The answer now was different. I needed exit. I needed ownership of my own narrative. So I walked out of that ballroom not empty-handed, but documented. One more artifact. One more refusal. One more piece of evidence that survival is not passive. It is active, deliberate, written in ink across cards that once diminished you. I didn't skip dinner. I quit the role of extra. And that line, more than any chandelier or embossed invitation, was the real ending to their performance. There's a wall in my office that no client ever misses. It isn't covered with certificates or diplomas, though I have them. It isn't decorated with glossy photos of smiling faces, though people tell me I should. No, on that wall hangs a single drawing taped to the plaster, its edges curling slightly after years of sun. It's a child's sketch of an open door. A rectangle tilted too far, lines uneven, the perspective all wrong. In the center of the doorway is nothing but white space. A gap in opening. I drew it the week after May first took me in. 10 years old, clutching crayons borrowed from her kitchen drawer, I had tried to picture what safety looked like. Not a house, not a family, not even a bed. Just a door open, leading somewhere else. That was my hope, that open meant possible. May kept the drawing taped to her fridge until the paper yellowed. Years later, after she passed, I took it with me. Framed it. Hung it where everyone can see. Proofline clients often pause when they notice it. They ask if my child drew it. I smile and say yes, because she did. Family isn't who names you, it's who says your name with respect. That line has become my compass. For years, Ruth and Gideon named me only in legal filings, only in letters demanding money or duty. To them, my name was leverage, never love. But May. She said Isabella like it was a fact worth recording. She spoke it with care, as though repeating it helped pin me back into the world. She was proof that family isn't forged by blood. It's forged by recognition. That's what Proofline is built on. Not vengeance, not retaliation, but recognition. Every receipt we archive, every tape we digitize, every place card we sleeve, it all points to the same truth, that existence deserves witnesses. I sometimes imagine what Ruth and Gideon thought as they left me on that porch. Maybe they believed time would erase me, that silence would do their work for them. They never counted on the archive. They never counted on me turning absence into evidence, turning silence into record. I don't pretend that the verdict healed me. Paper doesn't heal. Court seals don't warm you at night. But what they do is protect. They close doors behind you so you can finally walk through new ones. The open door on May's wall is my reminder. That child who drew it didn't know what lay on the other side. She just knew the door had to be open because closed had nearly killed her. That open door is why I sit here today telling this story, not as curse, not as debtor, not as overflow, but as archivist, as founder, as someone who writes her own record. And maybe that's all family is meant to be. Not those who hand you roles, but those who respect your name enough to say it without erasing, without bargaining, without shame. Proofline is more than mine now. It's a harbor for anyone who needs a record when memory won't do. For the foster kid with no birth certificate. For the woman whose name was scrubbed from a will. for the son whose father claims it never happened. We give them sleeves, stamps, time codes, proof. We give them open doors. Family isn't who names you. It's who says your name with respect. That's the legacy May left me. That's the reason I don't sit at overflow tables anymore. Don't answer invoices dressed as duty. Don't wait for letters that will only return stamped in red. My archive is my family now. Each artifact is a sibling. Each binder a parent, each receipt a vow that no one will disappear unmarked again. So I look at that drawing and remind myself, open is enough. Have you drawn your boundaries to protect your peace? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if not yet. Share your story and don't forget to subscribe for more.